I'm a writer. I know dialogue.
That's a fountain of conversation, man. That's a geyser.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Yes, provocative.
Oh, Daddy, stand back, man. Woo! Rock and roll!
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and follow on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, where you get exclusive videos weekly. Links to all the social media sites at bookedonrock.com. It's another edition of The Dialogue, a chill and chat with authors, fellow podcasters, listeners, and more. My guest is Rob Kassees. He is the host of a must-listen podcast for classic rock fans called 1001 Album Complaints, a weekly album review show where musicians select, analyze, and laugh about an album from the book 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. Rob gives his thoughts on classic albums like Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, Metallica's Black Album, and the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. Do they live up to their legendary status? He also shares his favorite rock books, including ones by Bruce Springsteen and the Beastie Boys, along with a guilty pleasure read about Led Zeppelin and an artistically inspiring book from David Byrne of Talking Heads. And there's one legendary artist who Rob thinks is overrated. You're about to find out which one and why. So let's get to it. Here is Rob Kassees. Rob Kassees, thanks for being on the podcast. How you doing?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm doing great.
Before we get to your podcast, 1001 Album Complaints, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? I know you're checking in from Sacramento right now. Is that where you're originally from, and how did you get into music?
Yeah, no, I'm originally from Wilmington, Delaware, on the East Coast, just south of Philadelphia, almost a suburb of Philadelphia, really. And I went to high school and college over there, met a lot of great people. And I grew up listening to my parents' records, just being a music appreciator, watching MTV in the relatively early days of MTV, and initially buying anything MTV told me to buy, and then sort of Nirvana came out at a seminal moment in my life. And, you know, around 15, picked up a guitar. Stories like a lot of other people, right? And back in high school and college, at that point, everyone was learning an instrument, playing an instrument. People were a year or two ahead of me, so you learned just a ton from your friends, and you shared information, and you jammed together, and you played in bands, and just really kept it going from there. Learned to sing, play a bit of piano these days, and ended up being pretty serious about playing in bands in my 20s, and playing a ton of gigs and taking it seriously, let's say, not making serious money. And as I've gotten older, you know, I've continued to appreciate music and playing music and talking about it. So the podcast really generated out of that, out of an interest during the pandemic to stay connected with old friends who were all musicians themselves. A bunch of guys we grew up with and went to school with and had played in various bands with. And this was an opportunity to recreate some of the bar conversations that we have already, which is just nitpicking what's on the jukebox, talking about the little anecdotes that we learned from VH1 Behind the Music or similar programs, and talking about why some songs are good and why some songs aren't so good, and just to recreate that, and an excuse to talk to your friends. And also what we realized when we got started is that it's been a really fun excuse to stay, I don't want to say current with music, but there is a tendency as one gets older to not listen to new music as often. So this has been a really cool excuse to force us, some weeks in any case, we cover a different album every week, to listen to new music and kind of keep it flowing.
I was just listening today to the latest episode on Frank Sinatra. The podcast is based on a book written by Robert Dimery. Robert was actually on this podcast last fall to talk about his book, Music Quake, the most disruptive moments in music. Your podcast is based on another book of his.
Yeah, so he published a book. I think it was first published, I want to say in the late 90s, maybe early 2000s, called 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. And yeah, a seminal book, a compendium of the most influential albums, music albums that have ever come out, right? And he writes a little review of each one and talks about its relative importance in the musical canon. And I believe, I could be mistaken, but I believe that book is what kicked off the sort of concept of the 1001. So now you see a lot of books, 1001 places you must visit before you diet, 1001, dishes you must try, that kind of stuff. I think, although he was not able to trademark that terminology, I believe that's what kicked that off. So the book goes through chronologically from really the birth of what we would call an album, which is not the earliest part of recorded music. In fact, the Frank Sinatra episode that you just referenced is the first chronological album in his book, and it's partly because Frank Sinatra on that record, In the Wee Small Hours, could be said to have created the modern album, meaning a collection of songs printed to a 12-inch record that were very purposely selected and sequenced to cover a theme. And so that wasn't, there was music going on before that wasn't brought together and distributed that way.
So talk about your co-hosts. These are guys that are on the show regularly. I believe you got more than a few guys on the show, right?
Yeah, there's sort of 3 full-timers and 3 part-timers, but they're all old friends originally from the Delaware area. We all went to college together or high school and college or some combination therein. And we've played in various bands together throughout our 20s and 30s. So a couple of the guys are gigging now over in Delaware with a band, and then I'm playing and recording with one of the other co-hosts out here in California. But the rule is basically, and sometimes we have guests on, the rule is we invite musicians on to talk about these classic albums from a musician's point of view. That's really what it is. It's nice that we have all known each other so long because we have an easy rapport, and we have a lot of the same musical influences to draw on and reference to each other when we're talking about a new song that we're trying to break down, to reference another song from the canon that we might know. I think the challenge sometimes is having similar opinions, but we try to keep it fresh. And yeah, you alluded to, what's going on in that book. It's a great book overall. It's a big challenge, as you can imagine, to compile 1001 of anything. So hats off to Robert Dimery for that. I will say that we do, and all the classics are in there. Abbey Road's in there. Zepp 2 is in there, etc. Pet Sounds, all the things you would expect to be the most classic albums of all time. Dark Side of the Moon. But there's a lot of obscure records in there too. And so it really is a nice mix. And, of course, it's one critic's opinion, this Robert Dimery, the author, of what yielded the most influence and what has sort of some of the most musical children, as you mentioned. It's all about the lineage, the artistic lineage of who did this influence after it, and what did this beget. That said, we try to do a mix of those well-known records and those obscure records. We take a fairly random approach, and we poke fun a lot of times at the lists. The premise of each individual show is that we break down an album, and then we, at the end, all log a vote to say, did you really need to listen to this before you die? Does it belong on this list of must-listens? And they don't all belong in our esteemed opinions.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the things about the podcast that I like. And you even told me, I think in one of the early emails, this is an honest podcast. It's not everything is great. We love this, we love that, and there's nothing bad about it. This is an honest assessment of each album.
Sure. And like I said, it's replicating the conversations that musicians, I think, all over the world are having with each other over a beer. In that, and listen, we talk some crap, we have some fun, we poke a lot of fun. I hope this comes across. It's all done with love. We like to poke fun at even the things we love a lot, including things like Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, the classics, or the Beatles, right? There's some stuff to make fun of there, and it's all in the spirit of fun. Anyone who puts out an album, who makes an album, who sings and makes music, writes songs, it's extremely challenging, and we all know that from the musician's point of view. We've gigged to empty rooms and packed rooms. We've made records and released them independently and sold 0 of them, and some have been slightly more successful. We've toured. We've been through a lot of these experiences, so believe me, we know how challenging it is, and I have the utmost respect for anyone who puts themselves out there in that way. That said, records are funny. Decisions in the recording studio are funny. Songwriting decisions are funny, and we poke fun at those things.
You mentioned Pet Sounds, and I have become a bigger and bigger Beach Boys fan with each passing year. I don't know why. I wasn't a huge fan when I was in high school. I wasn't a huge fan when I was in college, in my 30s, and just suddenly over the last few years, I've just been getting into them. And the Pet Sounds album is just amazing. Have you done an episode on that album yet?
We have not done Pet Sounds.
What do you think about that album? Talk about that album and the song God Only Knows, which Paul McCartney said, I think he said it's the best song ever written.
Yeah, and that's really saying something because he's one of the greatest songwriters ever to walk this earth.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the high praise.
Yeah, it's been a minute since I listened to it, but I do know it well. I would say that it's a great example of a musician really using the studio as an instrument, which is something I've always personally been really fascinated by. It's something the Beatles were really great at. Bands like Led Zeppelin. It's, in other words, you go into a recording studio, and one version of the story is you just try to capture the sound of the live band. Hey, we have a great live band. Just put the mics on, try to recreate the live show on a record. And that turns out great some of the time. It can be a little challenging on its own. But I think that folks like the Beach Boys and a record like Pet Sounds and bands like the Beatles and Pink Floyd are in this other category of really wanting to use all the tricks of the studio to layer things extensively, to put effects on things you really would be very, very challenging to create live. Although now, as I say that, with enough money and enough human beings on stage, you can usually create them. So Pet Sounds is that. I think it's a studio project that uses a lot of the interesting technology and tricks of the studio. And two, the other thing that jumps out to me is that it's a very, songwriting-wise, like you mentioned, very vulnerable, I think the songwriting on that record kind of spans a lifetime, from almost like teenage level puppy love, wouldn't it be nice, to more nuanced and frankly realistic portrayals of love like God Only Knows, which you always hear people play at their weddings. And I'm like, he says the second line is the first line is, I may not always love you. It's kind of a bummer sentiment.
Yeah, I think he was falling out of love with the woman he was with at the time.
Yeah, but it's also realistic, and that's why I think people respond to it. It's the reality of the human condition.
Some albums on the list that cause good debate, I'm sure, like Metallica's Black Album. You talk to the older fans and they're not a fan of that album. You talk to the newer fans and they do love the Black Album.
Yeah. Well, I'm of the right age where I had that cassette tape. It was one of the early cassette tapes I bought. I really enjoyed the heck out of it. I think the Metallica fans were upset because it's a departure from this early sound of Metallica, which was much faster, much thrashier, just making it rock as hard as possible 100% of the time. To me, that is still an excellent album, but it definitely trends towards pop music. I don't have a problem with pop music, I should say.
Are there any legendary albums or artists that you feel are overrated?
I think plenty of things are, in fact, overrated, but I guess the one that comes to mind is Prince. I'm not the biggest Prince fan. It's not that I don't think he's good. I do think he's good. But I think he's put up on a bit of a pedestal, a bit too much. And I think he's an example of a guy, and there are a few other artists like this, whose quantity of work, there's a vast quantity, and they're very prolific. The quantity gets in the way of the quality, in my opinion. So you have really great material from a guy like Prince on a record like Purple Rain, his most famous record. And then you have, I think, some deep filler material, which is 100% skippable.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I mean, I don't know if I'm a fan of anything that Prince put out from like mid-90s forward, and he put out a lot of music. But then again, there are fans out there, and I'm sure many of them, who love the music he put out during that period. It's just, to each his own.
Yeah, well, that's the deal with music appreciation, is that it's 100% subjective. We're all biased. And whether it's about what was on the radio when we were first listening to music and falling in love with it, or just exposure generally, because our parents listened to it, or our friends listened to it, or our older brothers listened to it, you come with a bias. And I have noticed anyway that bias doesn't shift too much through life. What I've tried to do is continue to be open to hearing new things and to diving into new genres. And to me, and this is another part I like about the podcast is that we learn a lot from it because we try every week. We're doing one album a week, and we sort of trade off who is in charge of the research to divide and conquer the work. But every week we're researching quite extensively. My point was more that for me to learn about the context behind something, to learn about the artist's story and what the mindset they were in and how much money and time they had to make a certain record or what positioning they were in their career, all that stuff, and the little anecdotes of how they made things in the studio. And we talk a lot about that. Oh, this is how this was recorded. This is through this amp. And oh, in this example, they put the microphone across on the other side of the room. You know, the great example is the Whole Lot of Love. It's the classic Jimmy Page guitar sound, but you can hear it right at the beginning of Led Zeppelin 2, Whole Lot of Love, where he pioneered a technique with two microphones on the guitar amp, one right up against it and one across the room. And so every time he hits that guitar, you hear it right at the beginning, A Whole Lot of Love, you get this, what feels like an echo effect, but it's really just the second microphone catching the guitar sound. Point is, learning about the stuff helps me appreciate it more, and I enjoy that aspect a lot. That's an entry point for me to learn about something. Then I appreciate. It's easier to appreciate, see where people are coming from.
Yeah, I love all that stuff. Actually, Bob Rock was just on Chris Jericho's podcast, and Jericho asked him, how did he get that snare drum sound out of Lars? And Bob Rock's talking about it depended on the location of the room, the angles of the microphones, all that stuff just comes into play, and that stuff's fascinating.
Oh, yeah, and it's recording science is such a deep rabbit hole on its own, outside of even musical theory or songwriting. It's entire books, of course, can be written on that, and we don't claim to be experts on it, but we spent a lot of time in the studio and a lot of time experimenting with home recording, so we have some ideas about it. But yeah, it's just an insanely creative enterprise where, yeah, like you said, you can put the drums in the hallway, or you can be in a big gymnasium kind of setting with lots of room around you, or you can be in a tiny little box with a lot of padding, and then it's where you place the microphone. Oh, it's right above the snare, right, like literally right next to the drum head, or it's kind of above the whole kit, or it's, it could be so many things.
Episode 50 of your podcast is on Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, and I always say that is like the greatest album of all time. I mean, it just, what do you think? Is it overrated, underrated, or rated just right?
I think it's perhaps rated perfectly, but I would agree. I think it's the best complete album experience that one could ask for. I just went and saw Roger Waters. He did like a simulcast thing in a theater last week. He was playing a show in Europe, and I went to the local movie theater to watch it. And yeah, it's just terrific. Everything they did on that. Talk about mastery of studio trickery. But to me, so on that episode, we kind of dropped the guise of even rating the album or voting on whether it was. We started at the beginning saying, we all agree, this is an absolute must listen. This is why a book like 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die was written in the first place. It's because of pieces of art like this, which are complete cycles. All the songs blend together. Everything was poured over and is just very, dare I say, perfect.
Meticulous.
Certainly meticulous. Exactly.
Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you've got an episode on an album by Steven Seagal called Songs from the Crystal Cave. What's the story behind this? This isn't in Robert's book, is it?
If you look closely, you'll see that was released on April 1st, a couple years back.
Okay, now I get, okay.
Yeah, Dimery goes astray occasionally for sure, but maybe not that far astray. That one came about, we had a lot of fun with that one, but it came about because one of the things we do, and I suspect other musicians and guys in bands like to do this. You spend a lot of time in the car on the road, and you have to play music for each other, put on a mix or whatever, what have you. What we realized is that we love hate listening to music, to bad music, as much as we love the great stuff. They both spur conversations on a road trip. And so this really came about with us. I was on a road trip with my bandmate Tom, who's one of the co-hosts on the show, and we went through a whole cycle of what is the worst thing I could put on the radio for the driver to listen to so that we could laugh about it. And we went through a bunch of different genres, but at some point we got into purely celebrity albums. And Steven Seagal's was really exceptional. I mean, it's at some point it crosses from back into good, I think.
Well, I know he plays blues music. Is it all blues rock?
Actually, it's a mix, and that's the funniest thing about it, because it's about half milquetoast blues rock. It's fine, you know. He literally has a song called Music on there, which is just an insane title for a song. But then it's half like reggaeton, where he's doing a Jamaican accent. It's bizarre.
Wow.
To be clear, I do think it's worth listening to. Not maybe for the not for the same reason Dark Side's
Not
worth
for the
listening
same
to.
reasons as Pink Floyd, right. What are some of the bands that you followed growing up? You said you're a child of the 90s.
Well, actually, it's funny I said that, because I think even when I was young, I was really into my parents' music in the 70s. So my mother was a huge Bob Dylan fan. He was one of my early loves. The Beatles, of course. My dad was a big Beatles fan. So I got into 70s music pretty early. And another one, my personal band, the first show I ever went to was a band called They Might Be Giants, sort of a nerd rock.
Oh, yeah, man. They Might Be Giants.
Yeah. I was really into them in the 90s. And yeah, my parents took me when I was 14 to an all-ages club in Philadelphia to see them. And it was very exciting. And I've seen them a few times since then, of course. But, you know, in terms of stuff that was going on in the 90s, I liked it because it was a rock revival. You had guitar solos. Of course, I had Nirvana's Nevermind. I had Metallica's Black Album. I liked Weezer, you know, bands like that. But I've always been a little bit backward looking. And then I think by high school, I got into David Bowie, and that was a big... David Bowie, Bruce Springsteen, both guys were kind of big influences on me in terms of the aesthetic of what it meant to have a show and to be in, you know, to put on a visual production. And Bruce Springsteen more on the songwriting side. I grew up 10 minutes from the New Jersey border, so Springsteen's kind of big.
Birdhouse in Your Soul. They Might Be Giants. Props to that song. Great tune.
Oh, heck yeah. You know, I discovered that band by watching cartoons. I don't know if you're the right age, you have to be the right age for this, but they played Istanbul, the They Might Be Giants song, on an episode of Tiny Toons, which was a popular kids cartoon at the time. And I was like, what is this? This is so cool. They made like a little music video for it. And this is when I was 12 or something. And then I sought out the cassette tape, and yeah, never looked back.
See, that brings up a good point. Now, that is so important for bands, especially now, to continue on with their legacy, to get their music out any way they can. That's like with Metallica and Stranger Things. What was the song they played?
Master of Puppets.
Yes, Master of Puppets. That stuff is so important. You got to get your music out there, and you'll have a whole new generation of fans just by putting it out there for them to hear. It's so different now than it was back in the day. It's not just radio and MTV.
I think especially back then it was challenging, right? Because when I literally first started listening to music, as I alluded to, I just turned on MTV, you know, when I was 8 or 9. And whatever they were playing was what I liked, you know, Motley Crue. And then over time, yeah, I started listening to classic rock radio in the car with my dad, and you know, you learn things through there. But for the most part, you're just listening to what you're being told to listen to, more or less. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. There's some great music, great stuff came on MTV. A lot of those music videos made a big imprint on me in a good way. But something like They Might Be Giants, they were never going to be on MTV. They were, you know, that was never going to come through or to be on the radio. Or like Beavis and Butthead actually introduced me to a lot of weird bands too, because they would sort of review videos on their show, but it would always be the weird stuff. And so, yeah, I was always drawn to weird. I think I can say that confidently.
What was the first album you ever bought?
So it was Motley Crue's Dr. Feelgood, because I was watching MTV, and I still have a soft spot for Motley Crue, and specifically for that record. You know, it definitely rocks. I kind of moved on from that style of music a bit, but yeah, it was great. Because I was just tuning in and starting to care about music right as the culture turned. It was right at the cusp of when I first tuned in MTV. It was all Motley Crue, Poison, hair metal from the 80s, and then Smells Like Teen Spirit and Jeremy came on.
One band that I love and I think is really underrated, Blind Melon.
Oh, yeah. Well, that first record is really great.
And the second album, Soup, is outstanding. Have you ever heard that one?
I must have heard tracks from it, but I can't say I know the record super well.
It doesn't have any hit singles on it, but start to finish, it's just an amazing record. You got to hear it.
Well, actually, let's talk about that for a second, because sometimes I feel like the lack of hits on a record, it can kind of help me not be distracted. You know, sometimes when something's been drilled into your brain so much via being a hit song and being so ubiquitous on the radio throughout your life, it's it doesn't mean it's bad, but it holds a different spot in your brain. Coming back to stuff, I've noticed this with some of the albums we've covered, and in my later listening, yeah, that can be helpful to me. So in other words, I'm excited to listen to the Blind Melon record, partially because of what you said, because there's nothing to just distract me. I can just kind of listen to it as a complete album and take it in.
If there was a time machine and you can go back to any concert in music history, what would it be?
Man, that's a tough one. I have an answer for you. So since we've already talked about Pink Floyd is high on the list, but I'll skip over them and go to another favorite band and a specific era. I don't have a venue for you, but I would have loved to see Talking Heads on the Stop Making Sense tour, because that's a big one for me.
Yes, that's a good pick. You a big Talking Heads fan?
Huge.
How about David Byrne solo?
Yes, I know. I'll say the majority of David Byrne's solo work, yes. He was another guy. I discovered them when I was in high school, and he was just a huge influence on me as of the concept of what an artist could and should be, visually, and the fact that he's just got his hands in so many other kinds of art forms simultaneously, and then the fact that Talking Heads, the band, matured and changed their sound, I think, numerous times, all that, and he was one of the early concerts I saw as well.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Podcaster and musician Rob Kassees is with us. He's the host of the 1001 Album Complaints podcast, a series of rock book related questions. So let's get into it. Books on rock that you've read that you want to talk about. So you gave me your list ahead of time, and you started with Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run. Nobody tells a story like Bruce. This is what he writes in the foreword. Quote, DNA, natural ability, study of craft, development of and devotion to an aesthetic philosophy, naked desire for fame, love, admiration, attention, women, sex, and oh yeah, a buck. Then, if you want to take it all the way out to the end of the night, a furious fire in the hole that just don't quit burning. These are some of the elements that will come in handy should you come face to face with 80,000 or 80 screaming rock and roll fans who are waiting for you to do your magic trick. Waiting for you to pull something out of your hat, out of thin air, out of this world. Something that before the faithful were gathered here today was just a song-fueled rumor. I'm here to provide proof of life to that ever-elusive, never completely believable us. That is my magic trick. And like all good magic tricks, it begins with a setup. Wow, what a writer.
Listen, I love reading. I'm a voracious reader. I have been since I was a kid, and I love reading about music and the creative process. So I've read a lot of music memoirs and biographies in my life, and now with the podcast, that's another reason to read, more of those. But I would say this is truly one of the best written pieces, and I've admired Bruce Springsteen for a very long time as a songwriter. I think he's just amazing as a performer. He's well known, I think. And I remember reading the liner notes of a greatest hits I got on CD when I was, 15 of his, that talked about, well, I knew I wasn't going to be the best guitar player in the world, so I thought I'd better figure out how to sing and write songs too. And I think I literally took that and made it into my musical career. I was like, yeah, I should do that too. That sounds about right. So I've always kind of based my idea of what a great performer was on him. And what was nice about this is because he is such a great songwriter, storyteller in the songs, it's very possible to be disappointed when someone actually puts words to paper as prose, that they don't always fulfill how great the songs are as prose writers. But I just think in this case, and even that foreword you just read, he's so articulate about, not only his life, but about the creative process, about the drive, the motivation, everything that was really just alluded to in that foreword, that what is causing you to want to get up on stage and in front of either a packed house or nobody, which, Bruce has played to both. So to me, it was just very insightful writing about a person I already loved. And you don't always get that. You don't always get this aspect of story and really good writing and deep insight into how creativity works.
Do you have a favorite Springsteen album?
I have to go with the first one. I mean, he has so many great ones, but Greetings from Asbury Park, to me, is just really meaningful to me personally. It wasn't the first one I discovered. Those are probably the ones with the bigger hits on them. This one has Spirit in the Night on it and Blinded by the Light. But the songwriting is different. I think in the early part of his career, I think it's him doing his version of Bob Dylan. It's more freewheeling. It's his own thing. It doesn't feel like a Dylan clone, but I really like and responded to that version of songwriting when I was young. So songs like It's Hard to Be a Saint in the City or Lost in the Flood, to me, I think I wore that CD out, if that's possible.
Tunnel of Love has always been my favorite.
The Tunnel of Love's great. He's put out great material for a very long time. Even some of the more recent records are pretty darn good.
One book you brought up that I really need to read is the Beastie Boys book by Michael Diamond and Adam Horovitz. I'm a huge Beasties fan. And as you said in your email, this gives a holistic overview of a time and place in music, a whole scene, and making you feel like you lived inside of it. Any highlights from this book?
Well, I think it's great for anyone who likes the Beastie Boys, but more particularly, it kind of talked about the early days of hip hop in New York City from the perspective of fans, which the Beastie Boys were. They were young teenagers, sneaking into early hip hop clubs in Manhattan at age 14 and just soaking it in and trying to meet people and figure it out, long before they even wanted to get into music. So for that reason, it was really interesting. It's much more approachable. It's written kind of as a series of essays, so maybe it's even easier to take it piece by piece as opposed to reading it continuously. And I actually listened to the audiobook on this one, which had the Beastie Boys plus some other celebrities reading these pieces. So I thought that was just really cool. I just really felt like it made you feel like you lived in that time. And as a music fan, somebody who appreciates anything that came out of that era or anything that was even influenced by that era, you're always sort of wondering what it would have been like to be there. I just thought they did a good job of that. I should say, too, I can't say I'm a Beastie Boys super fan. I definitely like them a lot. And I like pretty much all the output they've had. But they've always seemed these very down-to-earth. Maybe it's because they're kind of similar in age to me. And they seem just like a down-to-earth group of guys who are having fun with their friends. They just remind me of me and my friends. Maybe everyone feels that way.
Oh, yeah, I agree. They were everyday dudes. And what I love about the book, the pictures really take you back to that time and place, New York City, early 80s. Hip hop is just a rumor, as it said in the book. And you just get that image of a guy with a milk crate and vinyl records inside of it. It's like, what's that guy doing, man? He's a DJ at the club down the street spinning records. It's an important time and place in music history. And boy, how far it's come since then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the other thing I think I dug about Beastie Boys is they did, especially as time went on, they got into some of their studio process and talked about how, so for instance, one of the reasons I think they're a great band worth diving into is because they were willing, they changed their artistic style consistently, which I think is it's really hard to do that, especially if you hit it big. So they hit it big with Licensed to Ill, kind of a frat boy rock, or it's rap over Led Zeppelin riffs, effectively. And they had a lot of success. They even were open for Madonna on tour, which some of those stories were really fun in the book. And then they completely changed it up and did Paul's Boutique.
Yeah, just mind-blowing.
Mind-blowing. So weird. So, and of course, you need the context to, I think, appreciate. I think Paul's Boutique does sound good without context, but it's so much better if you have the understanding of where the technology was at and what they had to do to create that at that time, this sound collage approach with very limited digital technology, if any. You're literally splicing magnetic tape together with Scotch tape in many cases, right? But then one of the things I took from it and I've used in my own thinking since then is that on the third record, they liked using samples a lot on Paul's Boutique, but when they got to Check Your Head, they had built their own little rehearsal space / studio in LA, and they said, hey, instead of crate diving for more samples, let's just jam as a band a whole bunch, and then let's sample ourselves and pretend it's stuff from old 70s records. I thought that was a really cool idea, and you could have fooled me because you listen to Check Your Head, and it does sound like they're pulling stuff out of the crate from the olden days.
Then there is the Led Zeppelin book, Hammer of the Gods, by Stephen Davis, who traveled with the band at the start of their 1975 tour in the U.S., originally published back in 1985. Boy, where to begin with the stories, right? Do you have a favorite from this book? Of course, is the shark story.
Sure. There's the shark one. Just the level, again, I'm not sure kids today can appreciate, just the pure level of debauchery that was going on, where they would just roll into a hotel, take over an entire floor, have guys they hired just to go down into the lobby. The lobby would be filled with young ladies looking to hang out with the fellas from Zeppelin, and they'd send dudes down there just to interview them, basically, to come up to their hotel rooms. Crazy orgies, crazy drugs. It's just completely nuts. And then wrecking the hotel rooms, obviously. Listen, I don't condone any of this behavior, but this is a great example of a trashy rock paperback, great beach read. It's just insane to think about what it was like. And so I've actually read a lot about Led Zeppelin. I like them as a band, but to me it's interesting that, something I learned a little bit later. I always now that I'm 40, I try to put it into context of how old were these guys when these things were happening. And so I think what I didn't realize until recently was Plant and Bonham were like 20 when the band started, and Page and John Paul Jones were a little bit older. I mean, significantly older at a time when 6 years age difference makes a difference to you. And then they basically formed the band, played a couple shows together, made Led Zeppelin 1, and immediately went on tour and started and just hit major fame instantaneously.
And recorded that second album during that tour, that first tour.
It's not, yeah, and they pretty much just didn't stop touring and recording almost for the next 5 years. And it took its toll also. There's a human element to it. Some of the guys got it worse than others. Obviously, Bonham eventually died, but before that, Page was a major heroin addict. It's amazing he's still alive, to be honest, to hear some of the stories about this guy.
Oh, yeah. Well, and of course, the guys in Zeppelin, they're not fans of the book. They say it's not accurate. If you're looking for the definitive biography of Led Zeppelin, there are other books. But, of course, the standout stories that they sold their soul to the devil, and they pleasured a groupie with pieces of a shark. And this is while they were staying at Seattle's Edgewater Inn in July of 1969. Members of the band Vanilla Fudge and their entourage used a fish caught from the local bay. Guys say that never happened. Another book you recommend is by Mark Palizzotti, who wrote a 33 and a third book on Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited. And I was fortunate enough to have one author from the 33 and a third series on the podcast. That was, I think, about a month or two ago, and that was on Tom Petty's Southern Accents. Michael Washburn is the author, and he was on, and actually have one coming up soon. Kimberly Mack just wrote a book on Living Color's Time's Up. Now, you have one that you want to recommend, and it's on Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited. Tell me about this one.
Yeah, so it's been a while since I read this one. I've read a bunch of these books, and for those who don't know, it's 33 and a third is a series where different authors write about a certain album that had a big influence on them. There's no real codified format for the book, which I think is one of the challenges of it. They're a lot of fun, but they go in a lot of different directions, meaning some are lightly fictionalized novellas about the making of a record. Some are critical deep dives into the musical landscape at that time. And this one of the reasons I really liked it, it's a record I love, Bob Dylan record I love, Highway 61 Revisited. It's the one that has Like a Rolling Stone on it and Desolation Row. It was really an accounting, almost like a studio notebook, talking about how they made the record and how records were made back then, and how Bob Dylan, although he's a hero of mine, is kind of a grumpy guy who didn't really like to do vocal takes and didn't want the band to rehearse too much. So you can hear mistakes on the record. You can hear the band miss a change in Tombstone Blues, and they just left it in there. It's kind of bizarre. And they talked about how when Bob Dylan, he hated the idea of A, doing separate vocal takes, and B, doing too many takes of the song. But also, he did not want, while performing, to keep his mouth next to the microphone. He couldn't be bothered to like stand in one spot. So they solved that by just setting up a ring of microphones around him so that he could move around, but they could still catch his vocal. It's, to me, little details like that are just real fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that stuff. The minutia. Going back to the Talking Heads, one more book you recommend, and that is David Byrne's book, How Music Works, from 2012. He explores how profoundly music is shaped by its time and place. This is one of the great minds in rock history, you know, as we talked about. Your thoughts on this book? You say it's a great source of creative ideas and inspiration.
Yeah, I really do think of this list, I would say this is the one I really think any musician, anyone who really cares about music should read. Because I think what David Byrne does, I already said I'm a big fan of his. He's a hero of mine. But this is a great example of how interesting and creative he is. Because he takes that title, How Music Works, and on a chapter-by-chapter basis, he looks at what that question could mean from a lot of different angles. So, meaning he has pieces about how the music business works. There's a long chapter about how the music business works, financials. He gets into numbers. How do artists make money on touring and royalties, and how did it work in Talking Heads? But then he also is more discursive and talks about how I think the byline you just read referenced something that really stuck with me, which is he talked about how the places in which music is played and performed, the literal architecture, shapes what it sounds like. And so the examples of that would be in the early days of symphonic music, of classical music, before they had figured out how to build a symphony hall with all these subtle acoustic aspects, you couldn't hear stuff in the farthest away seats. So the composers of that day, the music itself was more bombastic. There was less room for nuance because you couldn't hear things that were nuanced. So it had to be big and big hits, right? So they could reach the back seats. When they started to dial in how a symphony hall currently works, which is you can hear a lot of subtlety, even from the worst seat in the house, so to speak, then that allowed composers to get more subtle and more nuanced in their compositions. And basically that same concept and tradition continues, and he cites many other examples of how the room you're listening to it in shapes how people even make the music and what it sounds like.
Yeah, here's a quick quote from chapter 1 titled Creation in Reverse. He's talking about just that. He says, quote, "In a sense, we work backward, either consciously or unconsciously, creating work that fits the venue available to us. That holds true for the other artists as well. Pictures are created that fit and look good on white walls in galleries, just as music is written that sounds good either in a dance club or a symphony hall, but probably not in both. In a sense, the space, the platform, and the software makes the art, the music, or whatever. After something succeeds, more venues of a similar size and shape are built to accommodate more production of the same. After a while, the form of the work that predominates in these spaces is taken for granted. Of course, we mainly hear symphonies in symphony halls." What a brilliant art mind.
He has a brilliant art mind, definitely. And yeah, I think that's an example of something that we all kind of know intuitively. For instance, if you enjoy seeing stand-up comedy, we kind of know that the small club is inherently a better place to see stand-up comedy than a large stadium. The reality is that certain comics are big enough to book a stadium, and they do, and we go to them. And I'm not saying it's not fun, but it is a different experience. And similarly, if you've been to a lot of concerts, as I have, you may have noticed that as bands gain in popularity and gain in ticket sales, they size up the venue, they're able to play, clearly. Every once in a while, if you're an astute listener, you'll go see a band. I saw a band once, not sure if I should mention their name, but I saw them right as they were kind of breaking, and I could tell from listening to the music, they were in a large theater when I saw them. It was clear to me that they had just bumped up from playing small clubs with ceilings, maybe 10 feet high, to a big theater, and their sound had not yet progressed to fill the theater. And that is something you have to think about when you see these big arena shows, whether it's Taylor Swift or Bruno Mars or Van Halen or whatever. They have to level up. They have to change something about what they're doing to fill that arena. That is for sure.
Well, yeah, I remember seeing a documentary on Def Leppard's Hysteria, and the singer Joe Elliott, he was talking to the drummer, Rick Allen, who was kind of stressing out over the cymbals and what to play and where. And and all that stuff. And Joe Elliott said, listen, man, we're going to be playing in huge arenas. So the people way in the far back, they're not even going to know the difference. So just play with that in mind. Play with a big venue in mind. Leave a lot of space.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think there's a lot of other really interesting tidbits in there in the David Byrne book. So I think I might go read it again, to be honest, because it has been a while. But some of those ideas have really stuck with me for a long time.
So let's wind down with some books that you haven't read yet, but you want to read. And you have a few books on your list, some legendary jazz artists. And you were just talking about this in the last episode on Sinatra's album, how you're getting into more and more of the jazz artists from, I think, the mid-50s to the mid-70s. One book you want to read is by Herbie Hancock, another by saxophonist Wayne Shorter, which you just started reading. Who are your favorite jazz artists? You mentioned Chet Baker in that latest episode. Chet Baker's great.
Yeah, Chet Baker. So jazz is relatively new to me. I would say that through college, I listened to stuff from the 70s, Herbie Hancock's Headhunters maybe, and the Miles Electric stuff like Bitches Brew and some of the, Mahavishnu Orchestra, prog rock, fusion, things of that nature, right? Return to Forever maybe. But when it comes to that classic jazz, I really until recently, only had a passing knowledge of it. And a few years back, I decided to start learning piano pretty seriously, or take it more seriously. And that's been a window into discovering a lot of this classic era jazz, this kind of 1955 to 1975 acoustic era. So it's all still pretty new to me, is what I would say. I mean, I've known these names for a long time. But in terms of the greats from that era, I really like Thelonious Monk, kind of an obvious choice. I think he's an example of a great innovator. No one else sounds like him on the piano and how he composes. He's also known as someone who's written a lot of songs that have become standards very quickly, so you can hear his compositions on Miles Davis records and everybody's records thereafter. In terms of other piano players, I quite like a guy called Sonny Clark. He's maybe a slightly lesser known guy, but he put out a bunch of records and he was a famous sideman, a little bit more on the bluesy side of piano. But here's the main thing I want to say, and it's on display in the Frank Sinatra episode too. We talk a little bit about it, which is that discovering jazz, especially of this era, is also a process of discovering the Great American Songbook, the standards, songs that were written in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, often with singers that then jazz musicians typically remake and reform to fit their own needs and adapt. And so to me, that's been a really interesting look at songwriting, because songs were certainly written in a very different way in a pre-Beatles era. By the time you get to the Beatles, and the Beatles are amazing songwriters, however, something shifted about how songs are crafted. There's something that's a lot more simplistic about them, a lot more blues-based. The Beatles specifically often transcended that and made really complex songs. But if you go back to those earlier eras of Cole Porter and Hoagie Carmichael and the songwriters like that made a lot of these standards, Georgia on My Mind and Stardust and Dream a Little Dream, My Favorite Things from Sound of Music, things like that. They have a lot more intricate moving parts and intricate harmonies and the way the melodies move across the chords. So a lot of it has just been an interesting study for me on that level.
And books on rock that you'd like to see written that haven't been yet, and unfortunately your pick never will. You mentioned David Bowie. You wish that he wrote a book from his own perspective. There are plenty of David Bowie books out there, but none that came straight from him.
Yeah, he was notoriously a bit of a closed book. I think that was part of his artistic identity all the way through his death. I think he felt like he put himself into the music. He spent a lot of time creating, obviously, released a record the day after he died. And so it would have been great to hear more from him about his creative process, but frankly, it would have been antithetical to his ethos, I believe. Now, I should mention there was a recent documentary film called Moon Age Daydream that attempted to compile what there was of both video and interviews of Bowie. And I found that really interesting. But yeah, he's just a character that I was always fascinated by. He early on helped, one thing that I was kind of a weird little kid and not the most popular kid, as you can maybe imagine. nerdy. And David Bowie's one of the people who helped me understand that weird was cool. And that stuck with me. So
I want to give you the chance to plug your projects. Tell people where they can find the podcast, your music. Where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, so you can go to @TheChopUnlimited on Instagram. That is the sort of mother account for our creative collective, and there's a link there for our podcast, 1001 Album Complaints, as well as all the music that we're currently making. I'm currently in a Star Trek The Next Generation tribute band called the Beverly Crushers. We've released one record.
I love that.
And we're working on a follow-up currently, and then just last year we released a heavy metal concept album about Arby's, the fast food restaurant. Nice. Called Ghost Beef. So that's linked there as well. And of course, check out the podcast, 1001 Album Complaints. It's musicians giving irreverent takes on classic albums, and we publish it every Monday.
All right, and we have the latest episode on Sinatra. What's the next episode? Do you know what it's going to be?
108 will be Astral Weeks by Van Morrison.
Oh, nice, Astral Weeks.
Yeah, so get excited. That's a big one for me personally, but we did argue about it a little bit, I recall.
Hey, that's what makes it interesting. Rob Kassees, thanks so much for being here, man.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that was an adventure.
That was quite a show you put on today.
Well, let me just close this conversation by saying you are one unique individual.